The dense jungle lay still under the oppressive heat of midday, the humidity weighing heavily on the air. The trees whispered secrets, their leaves rustling as if they were trying to warn anyone who dared enter. But no one could hear. No one would have listened, even if they could. Deep within, in the heart of that impenetrable wilderness, a hidden treasure awaited. But so did something much more dangerous, something old, something far older than the island itself. The island had been forgotten for centuries, its exact location lost to time and myths, but in the heart of the vast, endless ocean, it was there. The map had led them. A cryptic relic passed down through generations, a map that everyone thought was nothing more than a fairy tale. Yet here they were, standing on its shores where the earth seemed to hum with an ancient, untold power. The air tasted different, thick with the weight of history, and the very land seemed to pulse beneath their feet. Jenna stood at the edge of the dense forest, her eyes narrowed as she surveyed the shadowy jungle. The tension in the air was palpable, a sharp contrast to the steady beat of her heart in her chest. She had spent years studying maps and deciphering clues, piecing together fragments of ancient texts. She had dreamed of this moment for as long as she could remember. As a young girl, she'd listened to her father's tales of treasure hunts and forgotten civilizations, of secrets buried under the earth's surface, waiting for the brave to discover them. But now, standing here, Jenna wasn't sure what she had expected. This island, with its dark, tangled undergrowth and eerie silence, felt like a living thing. She wasn't sure if she was stepping into a dream or a nightmare. Behind her, the others were making their way to join her, their footsteps stirring the dust of centuries-long neglect. There was Liam, the stoic archaeologist with sharp eyes that saw things no one else did. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of history and ancient cultures, but even he had been quiet since they arrived. Then there was Maya, the geologist, her fascination with rocks and minerals as deep as Jenna's obsession with ancient civilizations. Lastly, there was Andrew, the ex-marine turned guide. Tough, unyielding, but his nerves were starting to show. He had his doubts about this journey, but the promise of treasure was something even he couldn't ignore. "You sure this is the place?" Andrew's voice was thick with skepticism, his hand on the hilt of his knife, as if he thought something might leap out from the jungle at any moment. Jenna didn't answer right away. She was focused on the stone archway just ahead, half obscured by thick vines. The moss-covered stones looked like they had been carved by hands long since turned to dust, their intricate patterns fading into obscurity. "We're here," she said softly. "The treasure is here. We just have to get to it." The words felt hollow in her mouth. She had said them countless times over the past few weeks, affirming her faith in the legend. But now, as she looked at the entrance to the temple, this ancient, ominous structure, it felt wrong. The air felt too still, the jungle too silent. Something was waiting. But what? Liam stepped forward, his fingers brushing the stone as if he was trying to feel the pulse of the temple. "This is ancient," he murmured, his voice filled with awe. "Older than anything I've ever seen. The craftsmanship is astonishing. This could be a discovery that changes everything we know about early civilizations." Maya nodded, but there was a hesitance in her voice. "If it's so old, why has no one found it before? It feels too preserved, too perfect." Jenna's gaze lingered on the stone doors ahead. She could sense it too, the eerie perfection of it. It was almost as if the temple had been waiting, as if it had been expecting them. She didn't want to think about that, but a small knot of unease tightened in her stomach. "Maybe we're not meant to find it," Andrew said. His voice had taken on an edge. "Maybe the treasure is meant to stay buried." "We've come this far," Jenna said firmly, even though she wasn't sure she believed the words herself. "We can't turn back now." The group advanced together, pushing through the vines and into the temple's shadowed heart. The air inside was cool and heavy with dust. The walls were adorned with strange symbols, runes that seemed to shift in the dim light, their meanings lost to time. At the centre of the room stood a pedestal, atop which rested an ancient book. Its cover was worn, the leather cracked and faded, but it emanated an undeniable energy. Jenna knew this was it, the key to unlocking the treasure. Liam was the first to reach it. He knelt down, his fingers brushing the pages of the book as he examined it carefully. It's written in a language I've never seen before, he said, his voice tense. But there's something familiar about it, almost like it's speaking directly to me. Andrew, ever cautious, stood by the entrance, his eyes scanning the room for anything that might go wrong. This feels wrong, he muttered. We don't know what we're dealing with. But Jenna, driven by her need for discovery, wasn't deterred. We've come this far. We have to solve it. We can't just leave. The book seemed to pulse as she spoke, almost as if it was alive. The moment her fingers brushed its surface, a low rumble echoed through the temple. The air seemed to crackle with tension. Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to shift and the walls trembled. A cold, hollow voice rang out through the chamber, a voice neither human nor animal, but something ancient and foreboding. Answer the riddles or face the consequences. The words echoed in the silence, leaving a strange, unsettling feeling hanging in the air. Jenna's heart raced. She could feel the weight of their task. This was no simple treasure hunt. This was something more, something that could end them all if they failed. She turned to the group, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and resolve. We have no choice. We have to solve them. We must. And so the adventure began. An adventure that would test their wits, their courage, and ultimately their very lives. Jenna's fingers trembled against the ancient book as she slowly turned the first page. The symbols danced before her eyes, twisting and shifting in ways that didn't make sense, almost like they were alive. She could feel the air grow heavier with each passing second, as if the very temple was watching them. Every breath she took seemed to reverberate against the stone walls. Liam was still crouched beside her, his eyes fixed on the text, his brow furrowed in concentration. I don't recognise any of this, he muttered under his breath, brushing his fingers across the strange writing. But there's something familiar, as if I've seen it in a dream. Andrew, standing at the entrance, shifted uncomfortably. This isn't right, he said, his voice low but firm. I don't care what treasure's hidden here. Something feels wrong. Jenna glanced back at him, trying to ignore the growing unease gnawing at her gut. We've come too far to back out now, she said, though her voice lacked the conviction she hoped it would carry. The words echoed in the silence, the weight of them making her feel even more uncertain. Suddenly the ground beneath them trembled again, this time more violently. The stone beneath her feet shifted, and a deep, resounding sound echoed through the chamber. It wasn't just the rumbling of the earth, it was something much more deliberate, as though the temple itself had awakened. The air felt thick and charged, crackling with an energy that made the hairs on the back of Jenna's neck stand on end. Liam shot to his feet. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice rising with alarm. "It's like the whole temple is reacting to us." Jenna's eyes flicked around the room, searching for the source of the disturbance. The stone archway they had entered through seemed to grow darker, the shadows deeper, as though something was moving within the walls. "I heard it," Maya said, her voice tight with fear. "What was that?" Before Jenna could respond, a voice boomed from somewhere above, a voice so deep and ancient it seemed to shake the very foundations of the temple. Answer the riddles or face the consequences. The words were not a suggestion, they were a command. Jenna's heart thudded in her chest. She swallowed hard. The voice, it wasn't just a disembodied sound. It felt like it was coming from everywhere, wrapping around them, binding them to this place. The temple was alive, and it was watching them. "Wait!" Andrew shouted, his eyes wild with panic. "This isn't some treasure hunt! This is a death trap!" Jenna tried to steady her breathing, pushing down the rising panic in her chest. She couldn't afford to be afraid now. She had to stay focused. "We're in this together," she said firmly, her voice unwavering despite the terror rising inside her. "We'll solve the riddles. We'll make it out." But even as she spoke, the ground shifted again, this time opening a crack beneath their feet. The air grew colder, and Jenna could feel the tension building to a breaking point. The walls seemed to close in around them, the space growing smaller with every passing moment. "Are you sure about this?" Maya asked, her voice shaky. This feels like something we're not supposed to be a part of." Jenna's gaze lingered on the book, the flickering symbols now appearing to pulse in time with the rumbling of the earth. She had to find the answers. "There was no other choice," We have no choice. We have to solve it, she said, her voice almost pleading. I believe this treasure is real. It's here waiting for us. Liam stepped forward, his eyes scanning the pages of the book. Let's just figure out the riddles, he said, his voice calm but with an edge of urgency. He pointed to one of the symbols on the page. This one looks like it's a question. Maybe it's one of the riddles. The group huddled closer, the tension between them palpable as they tried to make sense of the ancient text. The symbols were no longer just markings. They were part of the puzzle, each one a key that could unlock the treasure or lead to their doom. Andrew paced back and forth, his hand on his knife, clearly struggling with his nerves. I don't trust this. Not for a second. We should leave now, while we still can. Jenna glanced over at him, her jaw set. We can't. We've come too far. Andrew threw his hands up in frustration. You're playing with fire! We don't know what kind of curse is on this place. Jenna took a deep breath, trying to block out the doubt creeping into her thoughts. If there's a curse, it's not one we can avoid. We either solve the riddles, or we die trying. The last word hung in the air like a suffocating cloud. A low rumble sounded once more, and this time the ground beneath them gave way, a deep fissure opening up in the stone floor. Without warning, a stone door in the far corner of the room began to slide open with a slow, grinding noise. The air grew colder still, and the shadows deepened, forming shapes that seemed to move in the corners of Jenna's eyes. That's not good, Maya said, backing away from the door. The stone door creaked to a halt, revealing a narrow hallway beyond, lit by flickering torches that seemed to burn with an unnatural light. Jenna stepped forward, her heart pounding. It's a way out, or maybe a way deeper. Her voice wavered, but she steeled herself. The thrill of discovery mingled with a gnawing sense of dread. The treasure they sought was beyond that door, she was certain of it. But what else might await them? We have no choice, she said again, though this time the words were barely more than a whisper, as if she was trying to convince herself as much as anyone else. Liam turned to face her, his face pale. You really think we can do this? Solve the riddles? We don't have a choice, Jenna repeated, her voice stronger now, the fear in her chest turning to something sharper, more focused. We solve them, or we die here. Andrew's jaw clenched. He glanced between the door and the others, his mind clearly racing. He didn't want to stay, but he knew he couldn't leave them behind. Not now, not after everything. With a grimace, he nodded. Fine, but we're doing this together. No one gets left behind. And just like that, they stepped forward into the darkness, into the unknown. The riddles waited, the treasure called, and something else, something far darker, just beyond the door, stirred, as if eager to see who would survive. The moment they stepped through the stone door, the temperature dropped sharply, sending a chill down Jenna's spine. The air was dense with a smell of damp stone and the unmistakable scent of decay. The flickering torches illuminated only the first few feet ahead, casting long shadows that twisted and stretched across the narrow corridor. The walls were slick with moisture, and every sound seemed amplified in the stillness, from their breath to the faint drip of water echoing in the distance. Jenna's pulse raced. She could feel her heart beat faster with each step, as if the very temple was alive, urging them deeper. Liam was ahead, his hand brushing along the walls as he muttered to himself. There's something off about this place. He stopped, his fingers pausing on a stone. This is older than anything I've studied. It's like nothing I've ever seen. Do you think it's safe to keep going? Maya asked from behind, her voice hesitant, as if she feared disturbing the eerie silence. We don't have a choice, Jenna replied, her voice tight. We're too far in. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, winding and narrowing until they finally arrived at another door, this one much larger than the last. It was adorned with more of the strange symbols, their edges glowing faintly in the torchlight, giving the room an unsettling aura. Andrew, still wary and visibly tense, moved to the front. I don't like this, he muttered, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. This isn't just a puzzle. There's something else here. Something we're not meant to find. As Jenna reached for the door, a deep rumble echoed through the temple again. This time the vibrations were more intense, and dust fell from the ceiling. The torches flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows that danced around them like spectres. Without warning, the door creaked open, its heavy wooden surface groaning in protest. Beyond it lay a massive chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness, and its floor covered in slick, black stones. A vast pit split the room in two, the edges jagged and threatening. The pit looked bottomless, a void that seemed to pull at the very air, as if it were calling them to jump. Jenna hesitated, her hand still gripping the door frame. "This wasn't on the map," she whispered. This doesn't feel right." Liam stepped into the room, eyes scanning every inch of the space. "There's got to be a way across," he said, his voice tense but determined. "We have to keep going." Suddenly, a low, guttural growl echoed from somewhere below them. Jenna's heart skipped a beat. "What was that?" Maya gasped, her eyes wide with fear. Andrew drew his knife, his posture defensive. "It's coming from the pit," he said, his voice tight. "We need to be ready for anything." The group stood frozen, their breaths shallow as the growling grew louder, the noise vibrating through the stone beneath their feet. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. For a moment, the silence was more deafening than the growls. Jenna's heart thundered in her chest as she scanned the room, her gaze darting from shadow to shadow. She could feel the eyes of something unseen watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Let's move," Andrew said finally, his voice tight with resolve. "We need to cross this pit before whatever's down there decides to make an appearance." The group moved cautiously toward the edge of the pit, each step echoing in the vast emptiness of the chamber. The stones beneath their feet were slick, as though the entire room had been submerged in water at some point. Jenna reached the edge first, peering into the darkness below. There was nothing to see but the faint glimmer of something shifting in the shadows. She swallowed hard, trying to push down the rising sense of dread. "We can't see anything down there," she said, her voice unsteady. "How do we get across?" Liam was the first to look up from his map, his finger tracing the symbols carved into the stone walls. "There must be a clue here. Something to guide us." Andrew glanced over at him, his face a mixture of disbelief and frustration. "We don't have time for riddles. We need to move now!" But just as Andrew stepped forward, the ground beneath them rumbled again, this time much stronger than before. The stone floor cracked open with a loud snap, and from the fissures emerged large reptilian creatures, their scales glistening in the dim light. They were huge, with glowing yellow eyes and mouths filled with sharp teeth. Maya screamed, backing away in terror. "What are those things? They're not real!" Liam said breathlessly, grabbing her arm. "They have to be part of the trap! Don't let them get to you!" Andrew unsheathed his knife, stepping forward with a growl. "We'll fight our way through. Stay close." The creatures hissed, their massive forms moving in the shadows, circling them like predators. Jenna's heart raced. She had no idea how to fight these things, but she had no choice. "Stay together," Jenna shouted, adrenaline flooding her veins. "Keep moving!" The first creature lunged at them, its teeth bared in a vicious snarl. Andrew struck first, swinging his knife at the creature's side. The blade connected with a sickening thud, but the creature barely flinched. It snarled, its massive claws scraping across the stone floor as it shifted its focus to Andrew. "Andrew!" Maya cried, her voice shaking. The second creature darted forward, blocking their way. The group scattered, barely avoiding the snapping jaws and the lash of its tail. The tension in the air was thick with terror, each movement calculated and desperate. Jenna was frozen, her body on high alert. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to escape the creatures closing in on them. She had to think, had to do something before it was too late. "Jenna!" Liam shouted. "We need to get to that wall." Jenna snapped back to attention. "The wall?" Liam pointed toward the far side of the chamber. "There's a series of stones, stepping stones. We can use them to cross." Jenna nodded, her heart pounding. "Let's go!" They sprinted toward the wall, dodging the creatures as they closed in. Andrew's knife flashed in the dim light, cutting through the air as he fended off one of the creatures. But it wasn't enough. The creatures were too fast, too strong. "We're almost there!" Liam yelled, his breath ragged. The group leaped for the stones, scrambling to reach the other side of the pit. But just as they reached safety, the ground beneath them gave way again, the stones shifting with a deafening crack. Jenna barely had time to react as the ground split wide open, swallowing one of the creatures whole. The rest of them hesitated, and in that moment, the group made it to the other side. They were safe for now. The chamber was silent again, the only sound the echo of their rapid breathing. But Jenna knew this wasn't over. The deeper they went, the more dangerous it would become. The treasure they sought was getting closer, but so were the dangers that guarded it. "Keep going," Jenna urged, her voice barely a whisper. "We've come too far to turn back." And so they pressed forward into the unknown, where more riddles, more traps, and even greater dangers awaited. The silence was suffocating, and the cold that had crept in with the falling dusk settled like a weight on Jenna's chest. The stone walls seemed to close in on them as they moved deeper into the temple, each step heavier than the last. The torches flickered feebly, casting long shadows that stretched out in front of them, stretching like dark fingers toward their goal. The treasure was close. She could feel it, but so was the danger. Liam, always the quiet observer, was ahead, scanning the next set of symbols etched into the wall. "This looks like the final riddle," he said, voice tense but calm. "I think we're almost there." Jenna moved up beside him, trying to ignore the tension gnawing at her gut. "Almost doesn't count for anything. We've survived the worst of it, but I don't think we're ready for what comes next." Her voice quivered slightly, though she did her best to mask it. Andrew, who had been trailing behind, scowled. "We don't have a choice, do we?" His eyes burned with defiance, but his grip on his knife betrayed the nervousness he kept buried beneath his anger. "We've come this far. We either solve this or we die." The tension in the group was palpable. Despite the danger, they were too far in to turn back now. They were in a race against time. Every step took them closer to what they all wanted. The treasure, the glory. But they all knew something else was waiting. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark, ancient energy. The temple wasn't just a place, it was a test. And now it was time for the final trial. Jenna swallowed hard as she focused on the glowing symbols before them. The riddle was carved deep into the stone in the same strange script they had seen throughout the temple, only this time the letters shimmered ominously. Liam's voice broke through the silence again. "This is it. Listen carefully." He stepped forward, reading aloud the cryptic verse that had been etched into the wall. "3 are the keys, each a choice. 1 grants life, 1 grants death. 1 seals the door. The truth is spoken." He turned to face the group. "We need to choose wisely. This is the final step, but it's not just about answering correctly. It's about the choice we make." Maya's eyes darted around, and for the first time she spoke with conviction. "So, one of the keys leads to death?" Her voice trembled. "How do we know which one?" Jenna felt the weight of the question pressed down on her. There had been no clues, no hints, just the riddle and the looming shadows in the hall. "We don't," Jenna said, the words barely escaping her throat. "We have to trust what we've learned." Andrew gripped the hilt of his knife tighter, his eyes hardening. "Trust? I'm done trusting riddles. We've survived the monsters, the traps, and now this? This is where we get our answers. No more games." A low rumble echoed through the temple, as if in response to Andrew's anger. The ground shook slightly beneath their feet, a sharp reminder that the temple wasn't finished testing them yet. The door at the far end of the room creaked, as though it was waiting for the answer to open it. But the answer, whatever it was, had to be the right one. One wrong choice, and they would never leave. "I'll choose," Jenna said, her voice cutting through the tension. "I can't let this destroy us." Liam's face was tight with concern. "We don't know what's behind that door. We have no idea what's waiting for us once we open it." Jenna turned to him, her gaze steady, despite the panic gnawing at her insides. "We don't have a choice anymore. We've come too far. I won't let us fail now." Her hands shook, but she stepped forward, placing her hand on the wall next to the glowing symbols. The heat from the stone sent a jolt through her body, and she forced herself to focus, to push past the fear. She had to decide. One wrong answer, and the door would close forever. Or worse, the temple would collapse, taking them all down with it. "Here's what I think," Jenna said, swallowing hard. "The key to life is the one that opens the door. We've fought through everything to get to this point. The temple doesn't want us here. It wants to test us. It wants us to choose wisely, but it's also offering us a way out. We're not meant to die here." Liam and Andrew exchanged a glance, but neither of them contradicted her. There was a heaviness in the air, a finality to the moment. They could feel the pulse of the temple, like the heartbeat of a living, breathing entity. Jenna closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. I choose the key to life. The moment her words left her mouth, the room seemed to shift. The ground beneath them trembled again, this time harder. The walls groaned, and the shadows flickered more violently than ever before. The torches sputtered and dimmed. Then, with a deafening crack, the stone walls around them began to move. A new door appeared, shimmering faintly in the darkness. It was not just any door, it was a portal, an opening into the heart of the temple. Jenna stepped back, startled by its sudden appearance, her heart racing. But something was wrong. The air in the room had changed. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, growing deeper, darker, until they almost felt alive, crawling across the floor. The growls from the pit they had crossed earlier began again, this time louder, more insistent. The creatures were back! We've triggered something! Maya shouted, backing away from the door. It's not over! It's never over! The ground beneath them cracked open, sending pieces of stone crumbling into the abyss. The creatures, those monstrous beasts, were climbing from the depths, faster now, their glowing eyes locked on the group. They were closing in. Jenna's mind raced, but there was no time to think. The door had opened, but the temple wasn't done with them yet. The creatures were charging toward them, teeth bared, claws extended. Run! Andrew shouted, grabbing Maya's arm and yanking her away from the wall. Now! But it wasn't enough. The creatures were too close. They were surrounded. Their only way out was that door, if they could make it. Stay close! Jenna screamed, her voice breaking as she pushed forward. We're almost there! We're going to make it! They ran, but the creatures were right behind them, closing in. The gap between them and the door was shrinking by the second. Then, just as the first creature lunged, Jenna slammed her hand against the portal, calling out to the others. The door seemed to respond, vibrating with a strange, almost electric energy. The creatures screamed, but it was too late. The door flung open, bathing them all in blinding light. Jenna stumbled forward, her heart in her throat as the door swallowed them whole. And just like that, they were through. The room behind them collapsed into dust, the creatures' roars fading into nothingness. But beyond the door, the treasure waited. They had made it. But the price they had paid was heavy, and Jenna knew their journey had only just begun. The temple might have opened its doors, but what lay beyond would test them in ways that they could never have imagined. The blinding light from the portal faded, and Jenna stumbled as her feet landed on solid ground. She felt a deep, almost instinctual relief flooding her body, as though she had been holding her breath for hours, waiting for this moment. The roar of the creatures was now nothing more than a distant echo, swallowed by the overwhelming silence of this new, mysterious space. She glanced around quickly, her eyes adjusting to the dim surroundings. The treasure was just ahead. Golden statues, intricate carvings and jewels lined the walls of the room. The treasure was real, and it shimmered in the faint light, promising riches beyond their wildest imaginations. But the sight of it didn't excite Jenna the way she expected. Instead, a cold weight settled over her chest. The treasure was no longer their primary concern. Behind her, the portal they had just crossed from was slowly closing, its edges crumbling like dust. The sounds of the collapsing temple were faint now, but they were still there, a reminder that they had narrowly escaped death. Andrew let out a heavy breath. We made it. We actually made it. His voice, usually filled with tension, now carried a note of disbelief. He wiped his brow, his hands shaking from the adrenaline that was still coursing through his veins. Maya, who had been frozen in place the moment they crossed into the new chamber, finally stepped forward. She gazed at the treasure, her eyes wide with awe. This is everything we've ever dreamed of. She reached out a trembling hand toward the golden artifacts that lay scattered around them, but Jenna instinctively pulled her back. Wait, Jenna said quietly, the weight of the situation still hanging heavily in the air. She scanned the room, searching for any signs of danger. It's not over. Liam, who had been silent for most of the journey, stepped up beside Jenna. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his posture told a different story. She's right, we've escaped one danger, but there's something about this place, something we're missing. Jenna nodded, still uneasy. The temple had tested them relentlessly, and while they had escaped with their lives, the treasure wasn't the final piece of this puzzle. It never had been. They had made choices, risky ones, but they still didn't know what lay ahead. The treasure was a symbol, a test of their resilience, but it came with a price. Every decision, every moment they had survived, had been a gamble. Her thoughts were interrupted by Andrew's voice. "Are we just going to stand here and do nothing?" he snapped. "We got what we came for, didn't we? Let's take it and go." "No," Jenna said firmly, her voice sharper than she intended. She took a deep breath to steady herself, then continued more gently. "This place isn't just a tomb for treasure. There's something more to it. I can feel it." Liam turned toward the far side of the chamber, his eyes narrowing. "I think you're right. There's something hidden here. The temple didn't just want us to choose the right key. It wanted to test us in ways we haven't even begun to understand." Maya's expression softened, the excitement fading from her eyes. She knew they had barely scraped the surface of the mysteries this place held. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Jenna looked around the chamber one last time, taking in the beauty and danger that it represented. The treasure was a temptation, a reward for their survival, but it was also a trap. The choices they had made, the trials they had survived, weren't over. They had to face the consequences of those decisions. "We need to find out what comes next," Jenna said, her voice resolute. She turned to Andrew and Maya. "We've come this far together. We'll face whatever's ahead, but we have to stay focused." Andrew clenched his fists. "I didn't risk my life just to leave empty-handed." "We didn't risk our lives for gold, Andrew," Jenna said, meeting his eyes. "We risked it to learn something. We're not done yet." There was a tense silence between them, but slowly Andrew lowered his gaze, nodding begrudgingly. "Fine. What's the next step?" Liam stepped forward, motioning toward a large stone pedestal in the centre of the room. A glowing symbol was carved into the surface. It looked strangely familiar, like the symbols they had encountered throughout the temple, but this one pulsed with energy. "I think this is it," Liam said, his voice low. "The final test." Jenna stepped forward, cautiously placing her hand on the pedestal. It was warm, as though the stone itself was alive, and the symbol flared to life beneath her touch. The air hummed with a quiet electric energy. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the walls around them began to shift. The stones rumbled and groaned, like the temple itself was waking from a long slumber. The treasure, the gold, the jewels began to glow, but it was no longer beautiful. The light from the artifacts was cold, almost alien, as though it had turned against them. "We need to leave," Maya said, her voice rising in panic. "This place isn't what we thought it was." But before anyone could react, the ground beneath them trembled again, the chamber walls shook violently, and a massive stone door in the far corner slowly creaked open. Beyond it, darkness beckoned, a darkness that seemed to have a life of its own. Jenna's heart raced. "We don't have much time," she whispered. "This is it, the final test. Whatever comes next, we face it together." They made their way toward the door, the treasure now a distant thought in their minds. They had learned what they needed to: survival, strength, and the courage to face whatever awaited them. As they moved through the stone archway, the temple's walls seemed to bow, as if the test was complete. Once they stepped into the darkness beyond the door, they found themselves on the edge of a cliff, the wind howling around them. Far below, the ocean crashed violently against the rocks. Andrew was the first to speak. "This is it? This is what the treasure was? A cliff?" But Jenna, looking out into the vast expanse, saw something else, a horizon full of possibility. "No," she said softly, her voice strong and steady, "this is the beginning." And with that, they stepped forward into the unknown, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them, knowing that the true treasure was the strength they had gained, the bonds they had forged, and the wisdom they had earned through their trials. Jenna stood at the edge of the cliff, her eyes scanning the horizon as the wind whipped through her hair. Below, the ocean churned violently, crashing against the jagged rocks like a beast determined to break free. The violent beauty of the world around her was a stark contrast to the calm that was beginning to settle within her. The temple had tested them, had thrown every conceivable challenge in their path, but they were still here, still alive, still together. For a long time, the treasure had been their goal. Gold, jewels, riches beyond their wildest dreams. But now, standing at the edge of this unknown world, Jenna realised that the true treasure wasn't what they had fought for. It was what they had become in the process. The trials had forged them into something stronger, something better. Andrew was the first to speak, his voice strained with exhaustion. I don't understand. We made it, didn't we? We got to the end. So why does it feel like we're just standing still? Jenna turned to face him, her expression soft but resolute. We're not standing still, Andrew. We're moving forward. The journey isn't over, but we've come so far. This is our chance to start over, to take everything we've learned and build something new. Maya, who had been quiet for a long while, spoke next, her voice barely above a whisper. You're right, Jenna. The treasure, it doesn't matter anymore. We've faced death, we've fought monsters, and we've come out the other side. We've made it this far together. That's all that matters. Liam, who had been watching the horizon, turned back to them. We've all changed, he said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. I think we all came here searching for something, but in the end we found each other. We found ourselves. Jenna felt a smile tug at the corner of her lips. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when everything came into focus. The treasure, the danger, the trials, they had all led her to this realization. She had thought that survival was the only thing that mattered, that the end goal was to escape, to claim victory over the challenges they faced. But now she understood. The victory wasn't in the treasure or the escape. It was in the relationships they had built, the growth they had undergone, and the courage they had found within themselves. We've come a long way, Jenna said, her voice strong and full of emotion. We've faced impossible odds, but we did it together. We've survived because we didn't give up. And now we have a chance to build something better than we ever could have imagined. She looked down at the ocean below, the waves crashing against the rocks with relentless force. It was a harsh, unforgiving world, but it was also beautiful in its own way. A world full of possibility and uncertainty. The journey ahead was still unknown, but Jenna no longer feared it. She was no longer the person who had stepped onto the island filled with doubts and fears. She was stronger now, more resilient, and she knew that the others felt the same. Andrew let out a long breath and ran a hand through his hair, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I didn't think I could do it, he admitted, his voice low. I didn't think any of us could, but here we are. Maya reached out and placed a hand on his arm, a silent gesture of support. We did it, Andrew. We all did, and we're going to keep going. Liam's voice was steady, but there was a certain softness to it now. There's still a long road ahead, but we'll face it together. Jenna nodded, her heart swelling with pride. She had always believed that they could make it, that they could survive this impossible journey. But now she realised that it wasn't just about survival. It was about what came next. They had all changed, and they had the power to shape their futures, to create something new from the ashes of their struggles. With a final glance at the temple behind them, Jenna turned toward the edge of the cliff. There was still so much to discover, so much to learn. The world before them was vast and unknown, but Jenna was no longer afraid. She was ready. Let's go, she said, her voice full of determination. The group moved forward, their steps in sync, their hearts bound by the experiences they had shared. The journey had been long, and the challenges had been overwhelming. But now they were united by something deeper, something more enduring than the treasure they had sought. They were bound by the lessons they had learned, the growth they had achieved, and the bonds they had forged in the fires of adversity. As they made their way toward the edge of the cliff, the world around them seemed to shift. The sky was clearer now, the winds calmer, as though the very air itself had acknowledged their resilience. The path ahead was uncertain, but the uncertainty no longer felt like a threat. It felt like an opportunity. Jenna stopped for a moment and turned back, looking at the place that had tested them all. The temple, the treasure, it no longer mattered. What mattered was what they had become. We did it, she whispered to herself, a quiet sense of satisfaction filling her. She had done it. They had done it. The The group continued to walk forward, their steps light but purposeful. The sound of the crashing waves below was a reminder of the challenges they had overcome, but it was also a symbol of the freedom that awaited them. They had faced the darkest corners of their fears and emerged victorious. They were no longer just survivors. They were explorers, adventurers, and most importantly, they were a family, united by the journey they had shared. As they reached the edge of the cliff, they paused once more. The horizon stretched out before them, endless and full of possibilities. The road ahead was long and the future uncertain, but Jenna knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, they would face it together, and that was enough. The end of their journey wasn't the beginning of another test. It was the beginning of a new chapter. Then they would write together, hand in hand. The treasure they had sought had never been gold or jewels. It had been the strength, the courage, and the love they had found in each other. And that was the greatest treasure of all.